We are not going back to 2014. Ukraine is not going to reconstitute its country as existed before 2014 when we engineered the coup, is something that Europe has needed to hear for a long time. The United States has needed to hear that as well. Pete Hegseth went to the NATO headquarters in Brussels today and spoke with NATO defense ministers who for 3 years have been meeting and saying the same thing. This war is not going to end until we win. We're going to devote everything we have to in order to make sure that the Russians are expelled from every inch, et cetera, et cetera. All the things that have led to the bloodshed and destruction of Ukraine and not even getting close to any sort of diplomatic resolution. Pete Hegseth instead went and told these NATO countries, look, at least as far as we're concerned, you can do whatever you want, but as far as we're concerned, this war is, Ukraine's not winning this war. And we have to accept that reality. Here's what he told them.
Well, good afternoon, friends. Thank you, Secretary Healy, for your leadership, both in hosting and now leading the UDCG. This is my first Ukraine Defense Contact Group, and I'm honored to join all of you today. And I appreciate the opportunity to share President Trump's approach to the war in Ukraine. We are at, as you said, Mr. Secretary, a critical moment. As the war approaches its third anniversary, our message is clear. The bloodshed must stop, and this war must end. President Trump has been clear with the American people and with many of your leaders that stopping the fighting and reaching an enduring peace is a top priority. He intends to end this war by diplomacy and bringing both Russia and Ukraine to the table. And the U.S. Department of Defense will help achieve this goal. We will only end this devastating war and establish a durable peace by coupling allied strength with a realistic assessment of the battlefield.
I mean, that is something that Europe has not heard, that NATO has not heard for years. Number one, that the goal is to end the war, not to continue it. And number two, that you have to be realistic about the state of the war, the battlefield, which is extremely favorable for Russia and extremely unfavorable for Ukraine. And if the war continues, it will only get more so because Ukraine is running out of soldiers, running out of people to send to the front line, whereas Russia is not. To hear this, it's like music to one's ears. This is the sort of thing that a lot of us have been saying for 3 years now and got called Russian agents and Kremlin assets, et cetera, et cetera. Not because we were rooting for Russia, but because it's just the state of reality that you cannot deny. There was never a way that Ukraine would win this war. Ukraine would be destroyed, Ukrainians would be killed, and at the end of the day, the longer the war went on, the more the Russians would have, because the less concessions, the fewer concessions they'd want to make, given how much they poured into the war. So for Hegseth to go and say what he just said is quite remarkable. Now, the next clip is Pete Hegseth speaking as well, and he essentially is trying to tell them that the conditions that you told your populations that we would need in order to win the war and to stop the war are completely unrealistic. Beginning with the fact that there's absolutely zero chance that Russia is ever going to give up Crimea, and we have to accept that. Here's what he said.
Want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering.
It is an illusory goal. This is what NATO has been doing for 3 years. They've been chasing illusory goals, things that could never have been achieved. Now, whether that's because they really thought they could achieve those goals and were just deceiving themselves, or whether they didn't care about those goals and just wanted to continue the war, who knows? Probably a little bit of both. But to hear the United States go and again say, we are not going back to 2014. Ukraine is not going to reconstitute its country as existed before 2014 when we engineered the coup, is something that Europe has needed to hear for a long time. The United States has needed to hear that as well. And it's good to hear that being said. That's not all Pete Hegseth said. The primary demand of the Russians prior to the war was that NATO recognize, the United States acknowledge that Ukraine cannot enter NATO, that it is unacceptable to the Russians to bring NATO up to the Russian border, that part of the Russian border in particular. And Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Kamala Harris not only made continuous statements that that would never happen, that they would always leave the door open for Ukraine to join, they made all sorts of provocative statements that they were moving quickly toward a path for NATO membership for Ukraine. Pete Hegseth had a much different message.
A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. That said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine.
I mean, that is an absolute declaration, not only that the United States will not send troops, but that the United States will not invoke Article 5 in defense of Ukraine, will not go to war with Russia in order to defend Ukraine. A position in Washington that was once conventional, and yet over the last 4 years has somehow been degraded into something that only Neville Chamberlain appeasers or Kremlin assets are willing to say. That's Trump saying, we're not getting involved in this war no matter what. Already, there are Ukrainians and all the Ukrainian fanatics throughout the West, including in the U.S., acting as though Trump is Neville Chamberlain, just conceded and surrendered the war to Adolf Hitler, all this idiocy that has gotten us into these issues in the first place. And this was signaled even before Trump was elected. Here, the Ukrainians, through their Kiev Post, trying to create this framework where if Ukraine loses the war, which they were going to lose in all circumstances, that it would be Trump's fault if he wins and does a deal with Putin. Here from the Kiev Press in September of 2024, so 2 months or a month and a half before the election, the headline was, quote, Ukraine is gone. Before again calling for Ukraine to appease Putin, Trump runs through a series of verbatim Kremlin talking points, initially disparaging President Zelensky before moving on to the crown jewel of Russian disinformation narratives, namely that Ukraine doesn't exist. At this point, shouldn't Americans be asking who Trump actually works for? Those were the Ukrainians trying to interfere in America's election by trying to insinuate that Americans should believe Trump works for the Kremlin because he wants this completely senseless and extremely expensive in every sense war to be over. And you can see the Ukrainians were obviously rooting for Kamala Harris and the Democrats for good reason, which is that they would have fed this war forever. Here was the comments Trump made on September 25th, 2024, when he was talking about Ukraine and acknowledging unpleasant realities that no American leader or NATO leader has been willing to accept.
I watched this poor guy yesterday at the United Nations. He didn't know what he was saying. They just don't know what to do. They're locked into a situation. It's sad. They just don't know what to do. Because Ukraine is gone. It's not Ukraine anymore. You can never replace those cities and towns, and you can never replace the dead people, so many dead people. Any deal, even the worst deal, would have been better than what we have right now. If they made a bad deal, it would have been much better. They would have given up a little bit, and everybody would be living, and every building would be built, and every tower would be aging for another 2,000 years.
I mean, he was right then. You may not like it. You may wish it weren't true. The reality was that Ukraine had already been losing, and everybody in Ukraine and everybody in NATO capitals knew that, but were afraid to admit it. And Trump did, and of course then Ukrainian media, which as we demonstrated the other night, 80% of which is funded by U.S. aid to disseminate propaganda, immediately accused him of being a Kremlin asset, saying Americans should ask who he works for.